Thank you for coming out on Super Bowl Sunday. It's not until tonight, but really glad to see you. I'm glad the weather cooperated. I just wanted to say John Fia came here doing research on Philip Ficker's Fithian and years ago. I don't know how long ago that was, but when I see John, I'm always reminded of Jonathan Wood, who used to be president of the society and worked with John. And John wrote a wonderful, what's the word? Tribute. Yes, a tribute. And that's probably still viewable on your blog, right, John? Yeah. So John's blog is thewayofImprovement.com. So you'll find a lot of interesting, you'll find that and a lot of other interesting information there. John teaches American history at Messiah College in Mechanicsburg, PA, and he's the author of The Way of Improvement Leads Home, Philip Ficker's Fithian and the Rural Enlightenment in America, 2008. He's written other books since then, and you can talk to him about them. But I'm just going to let you speak, John, and we'll take it from there. Thanks.
Good afternoon, everyone. Everyone can hear me okay? I'm actually more worried about that I'm going to be too loud than too soft. My voice tends to boom. I give a talk once a month at a retirement home out by where I live near Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. And I'll never forget when a woman came up to me and said afterwards, "You are my favorite speaker." And I said, "Oh, so you're interested in history, American history?" He goes, "No, you're the only one I can hear." I hope you can. I'll try not to yell too loud. Again, it's good to be back. I was talking to Warren. I think it's been maybe. I came back for Jonathan's funeral or memorial service at the Bridgeton Presbyterian Church. That last year, I think, maybe, or 2 years ago, I can't remember, but I haven't been back in this building in, I don't know, maybe 6 years, 7 years or so. I spent a lot of time in this library. I grew up in northern New Jersey. I did not know a place like Greenwich actually existed, with all the history and all of the heritage and tradition of this place. I first discovered Greenwich in 1996 when I was a graduate student at the State University of New York at Stony Brook, searching for a doctoral dissertation, and came across the diaries, the Virginia diaries of Philip Ficker's Fithian. And then that led me to obviously come down here. That's when I met Jonathan Wood for the first time. And I guess you could say the rest is history. In 2008, I wrote my biography, which Joe mentioned, of Philip Ficker's Fithian. And then I was thinking about Jonathan. Driving down here, I miss him. He was such a mentor to me on all things local history. So that is a great loss, and I hope you appreciate all he was able to contribute to your collective life together and your history together here in Cumberland County. What I want to talk about today, actually, is a second project that sort of stemmed from all the time that I was able to spend here in Greenwich working on the Philip Ficker's Fithian book. I guess it was about 2010 maybe, 2011, 7 years ago, 8 years ago. I had this idea of writing a history of the Greenwich tea burning. Now, obviously, the Greenwich tea burning fits very well into the story of Fithian, and I write about that in The Way of Improvement Leads Home, that book. But what fascinated me more was the way in which the Greenwich tea burning, the monument, and so forth kind of shaped the identity, the historical identity of this town and this county. And that was very fascinating to me, and I'll mention some of that in a second. So I applied for money to the New Jersey Historical Commission and got some money to bring students, some of my students down here. Warren and Jonathan were kind enough to give us access to the library, almost borderline free reign, I think it was. We were looking for things and digging things up. It was unprecedented access, I think. But we spent 2 weeks here in consecutive years, consecutive summers. We did a lot of interviews. I don't know if there's anyone here that I would have interviewed, but we interviewed a lot of the people who have lived here for long periods of time, even the people who lived there for short periods of time. We were set up on the second floor doing interviews with people while the students were down here working. Jonathan was nice enough to kind of take us on a trip one night to Ocean City to keep the students, engaged and they wouldn't get too bored. But it was we called ourselves the Greenwich Tea Burning Project. We established a Facebook page and hoped that the money would continue to flow. Unfortunately, it did not. And I was just talking to Joe. A lot of what I want to present today stems from a kind of half-baked project that at some point I'd love to be able to finish on the Greenwich tea burning, both its history and the way it was remembered and has been remembered by this community. So I want to begin, again, I've written probably about half of this book. It's one of those books where I sort of started writing. Usually I'll collect all the information and then write the book. This was one of those books where I just started writing based on what I had, and then the remaining chapters I hadn't done any research on yet, and I need to go back to. But what I want to do is I usually don't read when I give you these lectures, and I'm not going to read for most of the time, but I want to read to you the introduction, at least, the draft introduction to this book, called The Greenwich Tea Burning in History and Memory. We'll probably come up with a better title. But this will give you some sense, at least, as to what the kind of questions I'm asking about this historical project. So let me begin. On Friday, October 3rd, 1958, while much of the nation awaited Game 3 of the World Series between the New York Yankees and the Milwaukee Braves, Greenwich was commemorating a commemoration. An estimated 3,000 people converged upon this historic village to celebrate the 50th anniversary of the unveiling of the Greenwich Tea Burning Monument. So, as some of you have been here a while, you know, Greenwich tends to have parties for events that happened in the past, and Greenwich has parties for monuments celebrating those events, right? Which has always fascinated me. Dedicated in 1908, the monument was erected to remember the group of young patriotic heroes who burned a boatload of East India tea in December 1774. Undeterred by rain showers in the forecast, a small crowd gathered at the Cumberland County Courthouse in Bridgeton for an old-fashioned community sing-along. After belting out rousing renditions of God Bless America, America the Beautiful, and My Country 'Tis of Thee, they cheered as 23 riders on horseback, one for each of the men whose names were carved on the monument, embarked on a 7-mile ride to Greenwich. Dressed in Indian garb, these riders, some of the boys and girls from the local 4-H clubs, dismounted at Greenwich's elementary school and took off running and whooping, was the word the newspapers used, down Ye Great Street to the site where the tea had been burnt so many years before. Awaiting them were piles of empty Lipton tea boxes, and the sights, sound familiar, right? And the sights and sounds of fireworks blasting over the Cohansey River nearby. The reenactors lit the boxes, did a war dance around the fire, and then fled the scene, much like their predecessors had apparently done in 1774. As the rain began to fall, the crowd was ushered into a nearby building, where it was entertained by a lecture on the history of the tea burning and a recitation of a poem by an 80-year-old Greenwich native who had come from California to read the same verses he had spoken 50 years earlier at the monument unveiling. At 3 p.m. on Saturday, the people of Cumberland County gathered in a grassy field just across the street from the monument. A band called the Jersey Raiders played patriotic songs. A one-act play depicting the events of the tea burning was performed, and 3 Greenwich girls, chosen specifically for their ancestral ties to the tea burners, placed wreaths on the monument. After congratulatory letters were read from Vice President Richard Nixon, both of New Jersey's United States senators and the governors of several neighboring states, Robert Maynor, the governor of New Jersey, delivered a keynote address. The speech exalted the memory of the tea burners, praised the great contribution that this small village had made to the cause of independence, and, remember, in the midst of the Cold War, reminded everyone within earshot about their need to imitate these revolutionary patriots whenever American liberty was threatened by communism. The day ended with tours of historic Greenwich homes and a $2 chicken barbecue. Now, there are several things worth pondering about this weekend that I just described in Greenwich. The fact that this was, and I've already mentioned this, but the fact that this was an anniversary celebration of the dedication of a monument erected 50 years earlier to commemorate an 18th century act of patriotism, is worth repeating. Whatever distinction we might make between the commemoration of the monument unveiling and the commemoration of the tea burning itself seems to have basically been lost on the people of Cumberland County. And here I'll stop and tell a story. I was also here in 2008 for the 100th anniversary of the commemoration of the monument. Actually, I gave a lecture right from this lectern on that day. And I remember I had my daughters with me, and they were both very, very young. And they were asking questions because people were dressed up in colonial garb, right, during that day. It was also the day of the fair that you guys had, is it the craft fair? Yeah, and so they were dressed up, people were dressed up in colonial garb, and then you had these 1908 era kind of guys riding those big wheeled bicycles around town and stuff, and my daughters were like, Dad, did they have those bikes are from colonial? You had to explore, things are a little mixed up here, Alice. There's some stuff from 1908 and there's some stuff from 1774. So same thing happened in 1958. There was no distinction in many ways between the two. The memory of the 1908 monument dedication and the memory of the 1774 tea burning converged during this weekend, creating one gala historical observance. The 1958 celebration also raises questions about the original dedication of the monument a half-century earlier. At first glance, it may seem odd that a community would erect a monument to an event 134 years after that event occurred. So figure, do the math, right? 1774, 1908. Why not do it in 1874, the centennial of the tea burning? Why was September 1908 chosen as the time when the monument was built, unveiled, and dedicated? Why not wait till 1924, the 150th anniversary of the event? As writer and public historian James Lowen has reminded us, every historical site, in this case the monument, tells two different stories about two different eras of the past. One is its manifest narrative, he says, the event or person heralded in its text or artwork. The other is the story of its erection or preservation. Why 1908 would be that question, right? What's happening in 1908 that would prompt this? What do the erection of the monument and the celebration of the anniversary of its erection tell us about the practice of history in this remote corner of the southwest Jersey countryside? Might these commemorations help us better understand the way the communities remember the past? These questions drove and continue to drive this project. I soon realized that this was going to be not necessarily a story just about 1774, but it was going to be a story about 1874, and 1908, and 1958, and 2008, and maybe some things in between. When I came to Greenwich in 1997 or 6 or 7 for the first time, I have been reading a lot of 18th century history of this New Jersey town. I think I read everything that was available. I came, it was time, and this project kind of walked around, get a feel for where everything was. I was drawn, of course, to the tea burning event, the tea burning monument. I wanted to know more about these young men who confiscated this tea during the night and burned it into town square. I was asking a lot of questions. Jonathan, if you were here, could attest to that. Non-stop questions as we drove around in his Buick at about 5 miles an hour. He's a very slow driver. And who are these people? Where's the evidence? Show me the documents. I was a young historian, right? How do I trace the people on that monument to the actual text? How do you know? How did you know who to put on that monument? There was a story here to tell that, again, had little to do with 1774 and everything to do about the years between 1774 and the present. This was more of a public history project than it was a colonial America project. I began my investigation, again, by reading everything I could. There were some very thorough and authoritative histories of the tea burning written by local antiquarians. But when I sought documentation to support their stories, as I just said, I often came up empty. Yes, there were a few pieces of evidence that I could work with, and I'll talk about that in a second. But most of the accounts I read were based largely on stories passed along from one generation to the next, Tales that eventually ended up in history books or pamphlets distributed by the local historical society. I hope I survived this lecture. Physically survived, I'm worried here. And then there were the names of the supposed 23 tea burners chiseled into the monument. Could it be possible that a decision was made to carve these names into a monument, a structure that would forever commemorate this important moment in local history, without concrete evidence that the men listed had actually participated in the event being commemorated? Using the resources available here at the Lummis Library and elsewhere, I set out to learn more about these men. And it soon became clear, however, that it would be impossible to link most of them with any level of certainty to the tea burning. And so the journey begins. In 2008, as I said, I got that funding. We made our trip down here to begin what we were going to call the Greenwich tea burning project, which has pretty much been on hold now for probably 7 or 8 years. The Facebook page is still there, because I actually checked it before I came. So on Facebook, you can see some things. What am I pointing this at here? There we go. So, here it looks familiar, right? There's one of my students. I'm back there talking with Jonathan. This is one of those times where I'm kind of picking his brain to no end. While Katie there is probably reading through, 19th century newspapers that we pulled off the shelf from in there. Here's our first team. The girl to my, my right is my seventh grade at the time daughter, who's now a junior in college, right? And then it's pretty much a female operation, right? And then there was me and Jonathan. Here we are in the Quaker meeting house. Here's the team again over at the monument. It was hot that summer too. I remember it was, we're 100 degrees or so. Of course, some of you have been over in the vault area over here. This looks familiar to you. There's a story behind this picture. This is upstairs. But you'll notice my leg. I'm laying there. My leg. I had just published another book at the time, and I was doing interviews, radio interviews, and I thought the best place to go was over to the Gibbon house where it would be quiet so I could do a radio phone interview. And right before the phone interview, I came walking through one of the shallow doorways. I don't know, was anyone there when this happened? I bashed my head, got knocked unconscious for a few seconds, fell, you remember this word? Fell, twisted my ankle, my whole leg, And then this was like the second day of the trip. We still had 4 more days to go. So, I had to lay down to keep the foot propped up, and we're reading. And then Allison, of course, we're just trying to keep her busy. She was 7th grade. She was finding things to read and study. But I survived that. But it was a sort of harrowing experience, to say the least. I'll come back to that in a second. Whoops. What did I do?
Hit that button again.
Menu. Okay, I'll come back to this in a second. So what do I want to do then in the rest of my time here in this lecture? I want to address 3, maybe 4 points, right? First, what do we know about the Greenwich tea burning? Let's get all the evidence out there. What are the solid facts that we know from 18th century evidence about the Greenwich tea burning? Second, when did the Greenwich tea burning become history? Now that sounds like a history professor's type question, right? But at what point did the Greenwich tea burning enter into the historical consciousness, if you will, of the town of Greenwich? Right, you'll see what I mean by this when we get there, because it wasn't always in it, is the argument I'm going to make. 3, I want to just give you at least one example of the way in which the tea burning has been used. We often talk in history about a usable past, a past that we can use in the present. I want to give you one example of how the Greenwich tea burning was used in the years after 1774. And in this case, I want to talk specifically about the 100th anniversary of the tea burning, which took place at the railroad depot in Bridgeton in November of 1774. And you'll see how the burning was used to promote a particular understanding of Cumberland County at that particular period of time, right? Remember, 2 stories. The story of 1774 and then the story of, why is it necessary to talk about the Greenwich tea burning at this particular moment, right? So this is all before the monument is actually erected. And then I'll end by just sort of gesturing towards some of my ideas as to where I'm sort of going to go if and when, hopefully when, I finish this project. So, let's talk first about what do we know about the tea burning. What's really fascinating first, and I just want to touch on this, is it's important to realize that Greenwich becomes the tea burning town, right, to quote Joseph Sickler's book, at a particular moment in time. Right? It doesn't become the tea-burning town in December of 1774. What is most revealing, I think, and this is kind of like an argument from silence here, but what was most revealing to me is the tea burning does not appear in the story of this town until the 1830s, almost to the 1840s. No one talks about the tea burning. No one's ever heard of the tea burning, or at least if they have, it's just oral tradition. So, for example, let's go all the way back to July 7, 1776. Right? This would be about a year and a half after the tea burning took place in December of 1774. The citizens of Cumberland County, local militia, they are marching to the courthouse in Bridgeton. And they're there on July 7th to hear a public reading of the Declaration of Independence. For the first time, the Declaration of Independence will be read in Cumberland County. It's an incredible event from all the reports we have from newspapers. The staves depicting the coat of arms of George III are torn down in Bridgeton. They're burned in the middle of the street, although the newspapers are clear to say that everything was done with quote-unquote great decency and regularity, right? We're going to get too crazy here, right? But everything is torn down, everything is burned associated with royalty. Jonathan Elmer, who is a doctor, chair of the Cumberland County Committee of Safety, which was the organization used to drive all the Tories the Loyalists out of Cumberland County, gives a speech. He says that a new era of politics has now commenced, and he invokes Greece and Rome and these republics from the ancient world that would only survive unless people were cautious and protected their liberties. Jonathan Wood used to remind me of this all the time in this speech. Elmer, so this is for you, Jonathan, this quote, but he attacked the Quakers of the town. Jonathan was never a big fan of the Quakers for whatever reason. I have some reason, I think I know why, but that's a whole other, he said the Quakers, while free to worship, right, should not hold positions of government because they were not committed to the revolution, Elmer said. He went on to talk about Cumberland County's role and the importance of Cumberland County to sort of help to sustain the new republic that was created in the United States. Of course, what's fascinating about this is, for my project, is nothing about the Greenwich tea burning is mentioned in that account. July 1776. Fast forward to July 4th, 1795, almost 20 years after independence. The people of Bridgeton walk in a procession from the courthouse to the brand new, it's a couple years old, 3 years old maybe, Bridgeton Presbyterian Church. They have just heard a patriotic sermon in the church from the minister, Ethan Osborne. He was actually the mainly stationed in Fairfield, but Bridgeton didn't have a minister, so he took care of both parishes, both churches. There was a review of the officers. There was quote-unquote food, drink, and entertainment, according to newspaper reports. And then there were toasts. The citizens toasted the ever-memorable 4th of July. They toasted George Washington, New Jersey Governor Richard Howell, a local boy. Anthony Wayne, the general, they toasted. They toasted the French nation. They toasted, it sounds like it's almost, at first I thought this was a kind of Democratic Republican because they celebrated the French, but then they also toasted Alexander Hamilton, right? So the Federalists were in there too. The sacred name of liberty they toasted. They toasted John Jay. And then they toasted the people of Cumberland County for resisting tyranny, right? You would think 1795 they might mention the tea burners. Nothing, no mention. By the early 19th century, early 1800s, these commemorative 4th of July events were reported almost every year in colonial newspapers and then newspapers in the early republic. They became more elaborate as the years went on. There were committees that staged these things in advance. For example, in 1820, the Bridgeton Patriots met at Jarvis Brewster Hotel, and another group met at the Inn of Richard Jarman on Laurel Hill. At sunrise, they fired guns. A band played revelry to awake the town. If they still weren't awake yet, they rung bells. The people came to the courthouse at 10 a.m. in 1820. They then again the traditional march up Broad Street to the church where the Declaration of Independence was read. Bands played patriotic music and songs. The people of Bridgeton were they were asked to decorate their houses along the path with evergreens. Boats on the Cohansey River raised American flags. Speeches, patriotic sermons, of course, delivered. Cumberland County's role in the Revolution celebrated, but there was no mention of the Greenwich tea burning. Other towns celebrated these things. Deerfield, Fairfield. The Patriots always give toasts to people like Christopher Columbus, the Revolutionary War generals, clergy of all denominations were toasted. The bands played Hail Columbia, Yankee Doodle, Farewell to the Heroes. In 1802, at least 100 people stood in the pouring rain in Fairfield to hear stories of the revolutionary generation. And again, more historical addresses about the role Cumberland County played in bringing liberty, but no mention of the Greenwich tea burning. The newspapers, two in the early 19th century. One, this is a clip here of the Washington Whig, which was founded in 1815. Both of these were Jeffersonian or Democratic Republican papers. If you were a Federalist, if you liked Alexander Hamilton, right? If you were a Federalist in Cumberland County, you had to get your news from the Trenton Federalist. You know, I hope that it came in a couple days after it was published, because both This was a Jeffersonian Republican hotbed. Some of you have seen Hamilton, right? These were the people that, these were the Jefferson-Madison group. The Apollo and Bridgeton Weekly Miscellany was founded in 1804, and the Whig was founded in 1815. I searched both of these papers in their entirety. I read through every word, and there's never any mention of the Greenwich tea burning. So the question then is why, right? Again, so far this has largely been an argument from silence. There's nothing. Where is the Greenwich tea burning, right? One answer to the question is people didn't really talk about tea parties or tea burnings or destruction of tea at all until the 1830s. The Boston Tea Party, for example, which, this was obviously in Greenwich, this was the Copycat Act, right? Didn't enter the historical consciousness of the people of Boston until the 1830s. The 1830s and 40s are important because there you have the first serious attempts to try to construct some kind of American nationhood, right? American nationalism. And nationalism, pride, patriotism is always going to be associated with stories from the past, right? This is what happened. These are the heroic moments. This is why we're proud of our country. So it shouldn't surprise us then that, say, the Boston Tea Party starts entering history books in 1830 or 40. And thus it shouldn't surprise us that no one in Greenwich or Cumberland County was talking about the tea burning until the 1830s and 40s. Another possibility was, as some of you know, the tea burning was almost universally condemned at the time by the leaders of the Revolution in Cumberland County. Right? So, we didn't like this act. We didn't like this destruction of tea, this destruction of property, right? So maybe that had something to do with why it never finds its way into some of the histories, right? Because maybe people want to separate from this act, right? It wasn't in good order or good regularity and decency, right? The quote that I gave you before. Another related reason why, maybe because acts of rebellion, destruction of property, for example, were not necessarily conducive to the building of a strong nation, strong republic, a nation defined by order. Yeah, burning tea in the middle of the town are great for rebellions and revolutions, but not particularly great for building things, constructing a republic. So maybe that had something to do with it. And then another reason is I'm thinking here of Ebenezer Elmer now, Jonathan's brother, who was a representative from this region to Congress. In an 1801 speech to the Cumberland County Democratic Republicans, Elmer said, quote, "We must yield peaceably in orderly submission as good citizens to the laws and authorities exercised us over by virtue." Again, revolutionaries disregard rules, but citizens abide by them. In other words, when you're constructing a nation in the first 50 years of this country, these kinds of rebellions are not usable, right? They're not useful pasts. So, you don't want to dwell on them. You don't want to enter them into the narrative, the storyline that you're telling. So, for probably the first 50, 60 years, there's nothing about the Greenwich tea burning. It's a non-event, right? Now again, I'm sure people have talked about it through oral history and so forth, and they have, as we'll soon see. They passed along tales and so forth, but it's never in any kind of official public documents. Now, this leads to another question, the second question I want to address here, and that is, how did the Greenwich tea burning then enter into the historical consciousness of this town, right? Here I'll make a quick comparison. A lot of times Greenwich gets clumped together with other tea burnings, right? Boston, there was one in Annapolis, Maryland, that Philip Vickers-Fidian actually witnessed. There's also one in the Delmarva Peninsula, the eastern shore town of Chesterton, Maryland, which some of you may have heard of. There's a great article by a historian at Washington College, which is in Chesterton, arguing that that tea burning probably never happened. There is absolutely no evidence whatsoever that the Chesterton tea burning took place. Yet they celebrate that tea burning in Chesterton every single year. There's a huge festival. This is an article by a historian named Adam Goodhart, who runs the CV Star Center at Washington. I don't want to scare you, I want to encourage you that there is evidence to suggest that the Greenwich tea burning did happen, right? So I'm not going to go all kind of postmodern-y on you, like, it never happened, you know, because it did. And there are 4 pieces of evidence that suggest that the Greenwich tea burning did take place. The first piece of evidence, and I'm not doing these in any particular order, there we are, comes from, and you can look at some of his letters over there, comes from Philip Vickers Vivian and his diaries. 3 times in Vivian's diaries in December of 1774 does he write about the event that would later become known as the Greenwich tea burning. So on December 18, 1774, Vivian writes, quote, "Early last week a quantity of tea, said to be shipped at Rotterdam, was brought and privately stored at Dan Bowen's in Greenwich. A pro temp committee was chosen to secure it till the county committee be duly elected." So there's a small group chosen to figure out what to do with this tea that was unloaded, and there's this larger committee of safety that's about to be elected that's going to actually make the ultimate decision. 4 days later, December 22, 1774. Quote, "The county met at Cohansey Bridge, or Bridgeton, and chose a committee, and it was recommended to them to examine into a proper care of the aforesaid goods," meaning the tea. Now, this Cumberland committee is formed out of a direct kind of requirement from the Continental Congress, which meets in the fall of 1774. They urge all local communities to form committees of safety or county committees for the purpose of making sure people are making the necessary sacrifices they need to be able to, keep the revolution going if they need to. There's all kinds of orders there about, to protect your sheep, right? Because we may need the wool. They're telling them to form these committees to make sure that all of this happens, and that the loyalists, those who oppose the revolution, are driven out or not allowed to undermine the movement. So right about the time that this committee is being formed is when the tea arrives in Greenwich. And then the third entry in Vivian's diary comes a day later, December 23rd. Quote, "A number of persons in disguise removed the tea from Bowen's house and, quote unquote, consumed it with fire." So those are the 3, right? That's from Vivian. The next piece of evidence that we have comes from, should look familiar to a lot of you here, comes from John Dunlap's January 9, 1775, John Dunlap being a Philadelphia printer and the editor of the Pennsylvania Packet. From the Pennsylvania Packet, this issue here, do we still have those? Can you still buy one of those here? Yeah, they're still for sale, right, if you want to grab one. We learned some additional information, actually, that we do from Vivian's journal. From the Packet, we learned that this temporary committee that was formed before the election of the it was actually a 35-member committee, included 5 men. So it's just a tiny detail, but it's more than what Vivian offered us, right? And then we also learned that the Cumberland County Committee, the 35 men that were elected out of orders from the Continental Congress, disapproved of the tea's destruction. Right, so we learned that from the Packet. The third document I don't have an image of, but the third document comes from the docket of the New Jersey Supreme Court. This was the civil case that the owners of the tea brought against the burners, right? Not a criminal case, a civil case. And here we get the names of 7 men who are charged with destroying the T and are brought to trial based on this civil case. Now, the 7 men are listed. We don't know what happened because the revolution actually took place and the New Jersey Colonial Supreme Court was dissolved, right? It was no longer a British court. So they got off the hook. That trial was never finished because of the revolution. But we do get 7 men who were involved, right? And then the 4th document we have is from the criminal case, the destruction of property case. And here, the Supreme Court Justice, the Chief Justice of the New Jersey Supreme Court, Frederick Smith, came to Bridgeton and held a special session of the New Jersey Court of Oyer and Terminer to indict the T-burners on criminal charges. When they tried to get a jury to convict the men, and we don't know the men's names here, no one was willing to convict because they were all patriots. So that made it very difficult for him to get his decision. But Ebenezer Elmer, in describing this Oyer and Terminer court in his journal, uses the term "we" to describe the T-burners, suggesting that in addition to the 7 names from the civil court, which Ebenezer Elmer was not one of them, Ebenezer Elmer is now an 8th member that we can know for sure, assuming he was one of them, right? So, that's it. That is all we know about the Greenwich tea burning. Now, you can think about all the stuff you've heard about the tea burning, right? And anything you've heard that I have not mentioned right here came later. Someone added that in. Maybe they added it in correctly, maybe incorrectly, we have no idea. But everything that I just stated is what we know. So, what happens next? How does this then enter into the historical consciousness? Well, we first have to then fast forward to 1839. Where was that here? Sorry. There's Elmer. Sorry, I wanted to get a picture up of him. Right, we. He used the pronoun there, right? Close reading of text. We do as historians. Let's talk about this man. Robert Gibbon Johnson. Have anyone ever heard of him? Yeah, some of you. Robert Gibbon Johnson was probably the most famous man in Salem County in the early 19th century. He was a wealthy politician, graduate of Princeton, or the College of New Jersey at Princeton. He was a leading agriculturist. He was a historian. He's often associated with the Jersey tomato. Some of you have heard him in that context. But in 1839, he writes, of course this is a modern cover, I couldn't find an image of the original one, a historical account of the first settlement of Salem in West Jersey. Now, of course you know, Cumberland County until 1748 was part of Salem County, so there's a lot in this book about early Cumberland County as well. Even though Cumberland County separates from Salem in 48, he continues to tell the story of Cumberland as if it's always been part of Salem well into 1839, right? So I don't know the local stuff here, Salem, Cumberland kind of thing going on, but that's what Gibbon does. Gibbon's book I would describe as providential history. He was a man of faith. The book is very much about, God kind of entered in and superintended everything that happened. Liberty is from God. It's very sort of God and country kind of story, right? The revolution was God's will. He writes about the tea burning in a couple of pages. First of all, he dates the tea burning November 22nd, 1774. This is a misreading of Fithian's journal that is actually going to be part of the story well into the for the next 30 or 40 years. Everyone in Cumberland County is going to get the date wrong. Because when you look at Fithian's journal, if we can go back to that quickly, I'm going to get this right here. So this is, in this period, Fithian was very sporadic in his writing. So this is from December 23rd, right? And then he has one from December 22nd and one from December 18th. But prior to that, the journal entry was November 6th or November 7th or something like that. So if you're not careful, you could assume that Thursday the 23rd or Wednesday the 22nd was still November, because he never actually distinguishes the new month. And that's what Gibbon did. So he claims a wrong date for the tea burning, November 22nd, 1774. His main source, which is he's now going to add to the mix here in terms of sources, and we can debate whether or not this is a reliable source or not, but he is going to interview the 87-year-old Ebenezer Elmer for this book, who has claimed that he was one of the tea burners. Now, what do we learn from Gibbon that we didn't know previously? In 1839, when Gibbon publishes his book, all of a sudden now we know the name of the ship for the first time, the Greyhound, right? Nothing in the 1774 documentation mentions the Greyhound. This appears in 1839, right? And we're assuming it comes from Ebenezer Elmer's memory. We know that someone named J. Allen was the captain of the ship. We know that the tea was stored not only in Dan Bowen's house, but in the cellar of Dan Bowen's house. We know that the tea was taken from the cellar to a quote-unquote old field and quote-unquote piled up before burning. And we know that a monetary fund was established by local patriots here in Cumberland County to aid in the civil and criminal defense of the tea burners. Unlike the 7 tea burners who were in the civil case, and add Ebenezer Elmer to that to make 8, Johnson says that there were 18 tea burners, but his list of tea burners do not include 5 of the 7 men in the civil case who we know from legal documents were involved in the tea burning. Everybody with me on that? So there's 18, but the ones in the legal documents that were charged are not part of the 18, 5 of them at least. Joel Miller, Abraham Shepard, Ephraim Newcomb, Silas Newcomb, and Henry Seeley. 2 of Johnson's tea burners in the 18, Joel Fidian and Thomas Ewing, were members of the Cumberland County Committee that condemned the tea burning after it took place. Right? So they condemned their own actions. Right? Now again, we don't know. Maybe they did burn the tea, and then later the next day condemned it. That's possible, right? But you see how this is getting a little messy now. Johnson insists that Philip Vickers Vivian was involved, but Vivian never said so in his diary. So the question is, why? Was he just not involved? In my book on Vivian, I suggest he was. But maybe not. Would a clergyman be involved in a tea burning? Maybe. There's certainly examples of patriotic clergymen. So this raises questions. I'm not saying Ebenezer Elmer's memory was bad, but it just raises questions based on what did he remember and what didn't he remember at the age of 87. So that's Gibbon. Then we move to Ebenezer Elmer's son, Lucius Q.C. Elmer, LQC I'll just call him, and the History of Cumberland County, published in 1869. Okay, so now we're about 30 years after Gibbon. Elmer, as some of you may know, was a judge, a historian, one of the probably most prominent citizen in Cumberland County in the 1860s. He also devotes several pages of the tea burning to his on the tea burning in his book. Elmer's take is almost identical to Johnson's, so it's clear he's just borrowing from Johnson instead of trying to go back to original sources, right? There are a few extra things he adds. We're not sure where he gets them from. But Elmer says that the captain of the ship arrived at Greenwich because he was afraid to proceed to Philadelphia. Out of fear he would be attacked by tea boycotting patriots. So we learned that, right? We don't know, but that's what he claims. We also, for the first time in Elmer, learned that the tea, remember, Fidian said they were in disguise. Elmer is the first one to say that they were dressed as Indians. It's not until 1869 that we get that they were dressed as Indians. Of course, the Cumberland County Historical Society has kind of run with this. Right? You all see these pictures, right? But these pictures, you know, there's no evidence from the original 1774 that they were dressed as Indians. So these pictures that are basically based upon Elmer's interpretation, right? He also claims, Elmer, he was a judge, so this makes sense, that the tea burners were actually involved in breaking and entering. He says they broke into the storehouse, and he implies that they broke the law in doing so, first to do that, right? We are also, I wish I had an image here, but thanks to LQC, we are also introduced to Henry T. Stacks. Some of you may be familiar with this guy. This is the guy who, according to Elmer, ran up to the tea and grabbed some of the tea before it got burnt and shoved it into his pantaloons and ran home with it to bring it to his family. And he's often viewed, Henry T. Stacks, he's often viewed as a man who kind of was a compromiser, who, you know, really wanted the tea for himself and wasn't a true patriot, but he appears in every account of the Greenwich tea burning from 1869 on. He's a great human interest story, right? You know, this guy who just didn't have the revolutionary fervor the rest of them, he wanted the tea, right? LQC, Elmer also concludes that, like Johnson, he sticks with the November date, right? So, didn't do his homework necessarily there. And Johnson claims that there were 40 tea burners. So now the number of tea burners is kind of all over the place by 1869, right? Final example here. I want to introduce you to this woman. Lucy Ellen Guernsey, her name is. She is a popular writer of children's fiction in the late 19th century, I'm sorry. She's probably best known for she wrote a very popular biography of George Washington. Most of her books were published by the American Sunday School Union, so she is a Christian reformer. In April 1874, Guernsey writes in The Atlantic, the most famous magazine in the country for educated readers, a short story called The Cohansey Tea Fight. Right, in 1874. So the nation now is reading this about Cohansey. It's the story of a girl who spends her summer vacation in Greenwich and learns about the tea burning from her great-great-grandmother, Sybil Howell, right, from the Howell family. Now, I think it would be wrong to suggest that Guernsey wrote her article to portray an accurate account of what happened. It's fiction, right? But it's clear when you read this article that Guernsey knows Greenwich. All the names are there in place. Fithian's in here. Richard Howell's in here. The name of the minister at the Presbyterian Church is mentioned. She clearly knows the landscape. It's unclear if she ever spent any time in Greenwich, but it's a fascinating story that kind of blends real things that happened with fiction. Interestingly enough, she places Lewis Howell at the center of this story. There's a romance there. Of course, Lewis Howell's brother is Richard, and Richard and Lewis are competing for the same woman, and this all plays into the Tea Party. So it's, you know, she's taking some liberties here. Apparently, Philip Vickers Fithian brought the, kind of had to mediate between the two. It goes all over the place. But she introduces the idea that the tea burners, while they were preparing to burn the tea burners first met at the home of Philip Vickers Fithian, where they dressed up like Indians. And then they went over to the Howell house, where they plotted and planned what exactly they were going to do. This is the first time we hear this. Now, I've taken tours and stuff and read up on this place, and these two stories are really, really part of the story. Just Sickler told. This is from Sickler's book, The Tea Burning Town, right? I can't find any sources that suggest that they met at Fithian's house or the Howell house, except for Guernsey's short story, right? So, again, I'm not saying that that's wrong, but I'm saying I want you to see how the soup gets made, right? How the sausage gets made, right? How history gets gets constructed here along the way. By the way, Guernsey is also the one who talks about the specific nature of the war paint, right? That it was Mohawk, right? Which, when I was here in 2008, I was talking to some people who were putting the makeup on, and they were making sure it was right. Right? So I don't know where they got, how they knew it was right. And I don't think most people in Greenwich know about Guernsey. But somehow that has seeped into the narrative of the story that we tell here. Okay. So, by the turn of the 20th century, we have all these other elements, right? We have the houses where they planned, we have the Indians, we have the fact that they were breaking and entering, and all the additional things come out. There's no particular primary source evidence, but it's all sort of oral history. So I'll close with this. In 1874, we come to the 100th anniversary of the Greenwich tea burning. By this point, thanks to Johnson, thanks to Elmer, LQC, thanks to Guernsey, and others, the story of the Greenwich tea burning has now entered into the narrative, if you will, of Cumberland County history. The tea burning now is something that you can make use of. It could stir up civic pride. It could stir up patriotism. And this is pretty traditional, what happens here, and what happens in other communities all around the country. In the wake of the Civil War, Lincoln talks about, goes to Gettysburg in the fall of 1863, Abraham Lincoln, and says, we have a new birth of freedom, there's a new sense of nationalism, right? And you begin to see local historians start writing. So some of you are familiar with Shepherd's History, right, that big, thick book. There's usually one for like every county in America that comes out roughly between like 1870 and 1890, right? This is a time when stories are beginning to be constructed, local history takes off, local communities are trying to connect themselves with the centennial of the nation in 1876. So national stories begin to abound at the time of the celebration of the 100th anniversary of independence, and local communities are finding their way into these stories. Now, what did the Civil War decide in America? We're not going to go into a full history lecture on this here. One of the things that the Civil War decided, apart from the fact that the Confederacy couldn't have seceded from the Union, the Civil War basically decided that America would grow in the way that the North was growing, not in the way that the South was growing. The Civil War decided that America, this goes all the way back to Alexander Hamilton's vision for America, right? That America should be a place of manufacturing, of economic independence, right? Of factories. And this way we grow our economy and we can become a major economic superpower in the world. In 1874, that narrative, that storyline, right? America now will move as it become an industrial manufacturing power in the world, is going to be directly related to what happens here in Cumberland County in the celebration of the Greenwich tea burning in 1774. That history is important to understand this event. We found this poster in the vault, I think, back there at one point. I think I remember correctly, Warren. I remember you running over somewhere and getting a copy for the students. They all wanted it. Some of them were teachers. They all wanted a copy of this to use in their classrooms. But this would have been an ad for the Centennial Tea Party. It was held November 25 and 26. There's a lot of debate in the local newspapers about why you're having it in November, because by this point they figured out that the November date was wrong. Right? So you should be having it in December. Right? There were huge columns, like 7-8 columns in the paper debating this point, back and forth. So it started a long Thanksgiving weekend. Some of the leading citizens, including LQC Elmer, planned this event. And it would take place, interestingly enough, where? At the West Jersey Railroad Depot in Bridgeton. The symbol of the railroad, industrialization, right? Manufacturing, progress, technology, right? This is where we're going to celebrate the tea burning. Now, it also could have been because it was the biggest space available, I don't know. Because it was a 14,000 foot space. 600 feet of gas pipe were run through the building to fuel these massive chandeliers that were present. A wood floor was placed over the tracks, the railroad tracks. Each town, I think there were 12 towns at the time, contributed their own kind of local flavor, their own kind of banners and historical artifacts and desserts, and turkey, duck, and chicken were served to anyone who paid the 50-cent entrance fee. There were special ceramic cups made. I don't know if we have any of those around. The tea burning teacups. There was a massive wreath that was surrounded with, we don't have pictures of this, but a massive wreath of international flags with a big sign with the name of the tea burners right in the middle of the wreath. So presenting this kind of, these tea burners were not just about Cumberland County. They weren't just about America, but what they did had international, significance here for advancing this great cause of liberty and so forth. People came from all over the region. Some of the local ministers complained because they held special Thanksgiving Day services and no one showed up because they were all at the railroad depot. Part of the day, I always think this is funny, part of the day was you could get on the railway and come to Greenwich and see the actual site of the tea burning. Now, no one quite knew where that was, but one of the local residents, Captain David Mason, claimed he knew the exact spot because the ground was a little blacker in that area. So you literally have people coming into Greenwich from Bridgeton to see the site of the tea burning, and this guy, Captain David Mason, showing them an area of the ground, quote unquote, that was considerably blacker than that surrounding it. And he concluded we don't know where it was, but this was the exact spot where, it's 100 years later, right? You would think, but that was the spot. New Jersey Governor Joel Parker spoke at this event. And, of course, he spoke about the tea burners and their importance. But the tea burning, as I've already mentioned, was portrayed as an event that set the wheels in motion for regional and national progress. Now again, 2 years later in Philadelphia, many people from Cumberland County went up to Philadelphia for the centennial celebration in Philadelphia. And there they could go to exhibits where George Washington and Ben Franklin were in one building, right next to the recent new designs in agricultural machinery and sewing machines and Westinghouse air brakes and Corliss engines. And you could see this massive celebration of progress in Philadelphia in 1776. Parker, the governor of New Jersey, makes the same kind of connections. These tea burners, he argued, not only set a revolution in order, but this revolution is now setting an industrial revolution in order. Without the tea burners, we would not be building to become such an industrial power in the late 19th century. Parker said, quote, "There is no manufactory in Europe that makes nails equal to those made in this town." Right? And again, a reference here to the Cumberland County Nail and Ironworks Factory, which was founded in 1815. Bridgeton is growing. It's becoming industrial. And at the time, it is, of course, the center of industry in southern New Jersey. The city had doubled in population between 1860 and 1885. Growing by leaps and bounds, manufacturing everywhere, and Myers connects the tea burning event to that form of progress. The 1874 centennial was also a celebration of old Cumberland County families. The ones with ancestries dating back to the Revolutionary era. It was organized and run by people who had political and social power in these towns. They talked about them inviting the rest of the people to their celebration, if you read the newspaper articles carefully. It's interesting that the event that occurred in Greenwich in 1774, which up until this point, when it was mentioned, had always been referred to as the tea burning. But in the hands of the social elites of Bridgeton in 1874, the tea burning suddenly became a tea party for the first time. This would not only be a celebration of a revolutionary event, but this was a clear presentation of a kind of Victorian middle class, upper middle class, asserting itself. Right? By staging a tea party, the women were not only celebrating their past, but they were also asserting their social leadership in the community and using their connections with the tea burners to do so. So again, I developed this a lot more in the actual chapter devoted to the 1874. But just to close now, what do we have left here on the slides? Where am I going for the rest of the way in this project? And I don't pretend to have any solid knowledge yet on how these chapters are going to play out. But I'm fascinated by the erection of the monument in 1908 by the Daughters of the Revolution. What's happening in the countryside of New Jersey in 1908? You have massive numbers of Italians coming to Vineland. You have Jews coming into the area, new immigrants as they would have been called at the time. If you look at the activities of the Daughters of the Revolution during this period, one of their primary things was to educate these uncivilized Southern Europeans, right, about how to here's your history, here's how you should behave, here's how to become a good middle class person, here's how to assimilate into American culture. And many of them, when you read the minutes of the erection of the monument, the sons of the Daughters of the Revolution, it's clear that they are again asserting themselves by saying, this is our history, and it's important that we stake a claim on this history in these constant changing times, these demographic changes that are happening. So I'm interested in that. I already mentioned the reference in the 1958 celebration to the Cold War. I want to see if the tea burning monument was used for Cold War purposes by politicians and so forth. I have a hunch that in 1974, the bicentennial, most scholarship on the bicentennial is focused with the sort of, happens right after Watergate, building up of kind of national trust. Again, how does the tea burning relate to that? And one of the things we found when we were here I was here back in 2010, was the way now in which the Tea Party has been used. I don't know if this is still going on, by the Tea Party movement, right? The modern day Tea Party movement, who has embraced the Greenwich tea burning as part of their political agenda. So as the story goes, right, how has the Greenwich tea burning been remembered and used, right? That to me is a much more interesting story. And there's much more available for me to tell that story than what exactly happened in December of 1774. So thank you for listening. I know I went a little bit longer than I thought I would, but yeah. Yeah.
Well, it's not actually a question, but I want to add something to your story, which is that in 1974, it was at the very end of Joseph Sickler's life, and very early part of my life. I befriended him, and one of the things that he wanted me to help him do was to give a public lecture. Mm-hmm. And that lecture happened at Greenwich Presbyterian Church in 1974, and his deal with me was he would do it if I would sing. And I wrote a song called "I Wonder What the Women Did When Their Men Friends Burned the Tea."
Yeah.
A feminist outcry, typical of the era. I just added because
I'll have to talk to you when that comes up, right?
1970.
And when I meet Thomas Jefferson, I'm going to compel him to put women in the sequel. Right? That was a reference to Hamilton, by the way.
Elizabeth Baby Fithian.
Yeah. No, we should probably talk, not today, but somewhere down the road once I get to that, because that is interesting. The role of, ERA and feminist movement, sort of what that, how that plays into the way the story's told in 74.
Absolutely.
I just assumed it would be a kind of white man's party.
Yeah, well,
But now I'm hearing a little bit more nuanced, yeah.
Sorry if I talk about it from my own point of view.
And forgive me for my Hamilton in there. Other questions? Yeah.
Yeah, great talk, thank you. I'm a descendant of the Ephraim and Silas Newcomb
Mhm.
men, 8th and 9th generation.
Yeah.
A couple of questions. What do you think the present day value on the cargo of tea that was burned would be worth today? And secondly, why do you think the burners dressed in mohawk
Yeah.
rather than, and did not use lenape?
Yeah, which would have been the local Indian tribe. Yeah, good. The first question I can't answer, because I don't know how much tea was there. I don't know what the amount of tea. Now, I do know there were 42 boxes of tea dumped in Boston Harbor in 70, there were over 200 boxes of tea dumped in Boston Harbor in December 1773 that was worth, by today's scale, $42 million. So, I don't know how much tea was there. Yeah. How many boxes it would have been, I don't know.
You might compare it to the Peggy Stewart in Annapolis.
Yeah.
One ship.
Yeah.
I think there were 17 chests there,
Okay.
but there might be pumped.
Yeah. I don't know. I could probably try to speculate it, but I have no idea how much tea it actually was. In terms of the second question, I would say first of all, I have no idea if they dressed in mohawk. Apparently, Lucy Guernsey, writing in 1874 in the Atlantic, said they dressed in mohawk, and somehow that found its way into both the 74 and the 2008, which I had witnessed the 2008 reenactment, but clearly the 74 reenactment was mohawk. So I can't tell you how Lucy Guernsey's reference to mohawk got into the 74 and 2008 reenactments. I will say this though, they dressed as mohawk, they painted themselves as mohawks in Boston in 1773. So if it was a copycat act, if Guernsey is right, they would have, or maybe Guernsey knew that they did it in Boston and that's why she superimposed that on the, it's hard to tell, right? Yeah.
I'm from the Bowens part. My family goes back to the Bowens. Things I've read said that Dan Bowen hid the tea from the Patriots.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's true or not, or whether I know his brother was a Patriot, but Daniel, I guess, was not.
Yeah.
But I mean, they said he hid it. Is that just
There's no, I mean,
or is that just a?
I don't know where that came into the story. I've heard that too. It's clearly in none of the sources that I've mentioned today that he somehow hid it, other than the fact that may just be a reference to the fact that it was in his house. It was hidden in his house, and by virtue of the fact that he owned the house, he was hiding it, right? It wasn't Dan Bowen's house. Vivian says that, and so I think so does the packet. Pennsylvania packet to January 9, 1774. So it wasn't Dan Bowen's house. And of course, the story, we don't know we even don't know if he was, I have to go back and look, I'm not sure we even know if he was a loyalist or not. It's always been assumed he was a loyalist.
Right, that's just James Bowen with the Patriot.
Yeah.
Another interesting conflict in interpretation is for the tea to be offloaded, you had to pay duty on the tea before you offload tea. There's no mention of the tea being paid. So it suggests maybe even a smuggling operation.
Yeah.
But then on the other hand, you had the consignees in Philadelphia suing.
Yeah.
Bringing the sevens to trial.
Yeah.
So obviously it was their tea.
Yeah.
They had an interest, that's an interest. So it's like, so was it being smuggled or was it being offloaded so it could be carried over land to Philly?
That coming over land in Philly, I've seen a few times in 20th century accounts, and I only went up to 1874 here. But the land argument I've seen a few times. I don't know what the source is of that.
Yeah.
Again, the point here is to not try to figure out as much as to exactly what happened, as to figure out why why things were added on at what different points. Like, why was it necessary to embellish the story if it was embellished? Why was it necessary to suddenly make a big deal about this at this particular time, and tell the story in a certain way at this time? That to me is more fascinating than, exactly what happened. I don't think we'll ever know exactly what happened. Unless, again, history always changes. That might scare some people. Right? But what I'm saying is there's a difference between the past and history, right? So as we get new evidence, who knows? We might uncover something, right, that brings this more into focus, and thus the history books will change. I know that scares people when you say the history books will change, but if you find new evidence, the history books have to change, right? So who knows what will happen? But as far as we know, I don't think, up to this point, it's a very sketchy event that doesn't hold the same amount of historical weight as the kind of weight is given in terms of celebratory, right? But having said that, I don't want to come across as like the snooty historian who comes into a town that's not his own, the outside agitator who's going to tell you everything you believe your whole life is wrong, right? But because if I had more time, I would develop the fact, and I want to do this in the book, that these kinds of accounts, right, are important. Whether they happen exactly the way they're said to happen, they're important because they do help people form a sense of identity and community and heritage that can be helpful, to a particular community. At the same time, they can also be very kind of devastating to the community. If you're building an entire political philosophy, for example, around bad history, and you're putting lives in jeopardy because you think America was this and it was something else, that's a problem. But these kinds of heritage and stories like the Greenwich tea burning, they kind of cut both ways. They give you a sense of pride and community. I think sometimes that's a good thing, whether or not the exact every detail is accurate. So I hope I can reflect that as I write this thing up. Yeah.
I'm curious. I noticed that a lot of the middle sources that you quoted, like between the colonial period and the monument erection, a lot of those were published histories.
Yeah.
I was wondering whether you had done any research into things like published genealogies and published obituaries and things like that to see what people were saying about themselves and their ancestors.
Yeah.
Particularly like obituaries from the late 1800s, which might go into extensive detail about even the ancestors of the person.
Yeah, that's great. No. That's a great that's a great way to kind of think about it. A lot of the stuff between 1774 and Gibb and Johnson in 1839, I could never have pulled that off if it wasn't for kind of modern technology and databases, because I have access through a database, which my college pays a lot of money to have, of every newspaper published in America between 1680 and 1875. So I can just type in things like Greenwich tea burning, Cumberland County, and read everything, and it's never mentioned until like the 1870s. That doesn't answer your question. That's a great way. That's a great way to move, though, I think. As we continue to think about kind of how to do this. I would love to. Right now I'm in the middle of finishing a book on the history of the Revolution in New Jersey, a massive overview that doesn't just focus on Cumberland County. Once that's done, I have another couple projects, but I may go back to the New Jersey Historical Commission to see. It's helpful for me to bring students because they can come down and read like news. So I want to put like 2 students and just have them read through the Bridgeton newspapers from like 1974. What's going on? How is this? And if I give them sort of certain things to look for, and usually they take way too many notes, which is good, right? So if I could get, and I had the money was used to pay for them and their food, and we stayed at that. There was a hotel in Millville that we stayed at, a little town in the country, something like that. Yeah. So I'd love to get back and do that because I think this is a story that not only is related to Greenwich history itself, like local history, but it also has implications for the way other communities think about the significant moments in their past that shaped them. Yeah. Yeah.
About a year ago, I was up at the new American Revolution Museum in Philadelphia. They give Greenwich credit in chronological order in that museum.
Yeah. I've actually been in the coffee shop there. But I give a lot of tours of colonial and revolutionary era Philadelphia. So like that's a bathroom. You can go into the cafe without having to pay. That's a bathroom stop. But I've yet to actually tour it. But it doesn't surprise me that it would be in there. I'd be curious if Chesterton was in there too. If you want, email me and jfea@messiah.edu. I'll send you that Chesterton article. It's really interesting. This guy who kind of was like, he moved to Chesterton, said, oh, the tea burning is celebrated every year. And then he started to investigate, and he was like, I don't think this thing happened. And then, but a lot of the articles about then how the people in the town, like, treated him. Once he said, I had to be careful. What I said and what I didn't say here.
Can you repeat the email?
Yeah, JF as in Frank, JFEA @Messiah College, I teach at messiah.edu. Yeah. Yeah.
When you show the image of the 15 journals, what are we looking at? Is that Philip Nicholas Dickens' original notes?
Yeah, great question.
Is it Brother Joel made, or is it some later copy?
This, I'm terrible at these names.
It looks kind of like more of a 19th century.
There's a,
And
how do I get that? How do I get back to? Yeah. Yeah, thanks, Brittany. I'll be back. I write about this in the biography. Like I said, I wrote
I was just
about.
reading it, that's why.
Yeah. The best, my take on this is that the writing you see comes from the hand of Philip's younger brother, second brother, right? So what you're seeing here is Enoch's hand. Enoch, we don't know, he was disabled in some way. A lot of the genealogy and so forth calls him quote-unquote crippled, is the word that's used. And the argument that I make, which actually comes from later family genealogists who did this, so it's, I'm trusting them, was that because he was unable to serve in the Revolution, he saw copying Philip's diaries as his service. So this is late 18th century. But he had an incredibly nice hand. Especially, I was just telling Lauren this, especially when you compare this to Finnegan had 7 volumes of journals. The last volume was when he was stationed in Fort Washington with the Continental Army as a chaplain. And that diary is a completely different hand, and it's virtually unreadable. That, I think, was Finnegan's actual hand, because that volume did not get to Enoch to transcribe, because Enoch died shortly after he transcribed this. So my hunch is, educated guess, but I put it in the book, is that this is not Finnegan's hand. This is Enoch's hand.
So the originals don't survive, he destroyed them?
The originals are, no, we don't have the originals. We have, these are what are in the Firestone Library in Princeton. But the last journal is there in Finnegan's hand, in Philip's hand.
So he must have given Johnson access to this, so that he believes that he read it and got the date wrong?
Well, Johnson, I think, I don't think Johnson, the only thing I think of, Johnson may have consulted the diary. From what we know, it spent a lot of time in the attic of Dr. Enoch Finnegan, a descendant, and that's where Princeton, I'm blanking on his name, Williams, his last name was, that's where the editor of the first journal in Princeton Archivist found it, or someone found it in Enoch Finnegan, Dr. Enoch Finnegan's attic. What was it, where Othello he lived in, or, found it there, and took it right to Princeton.
You mentioned the book, actually, it was given to a relative in Philadelphia with a different last name and with the instructions to donate it to Princeton. For some reason.
Do I mention that in the book?
Yeah.
Yeah.
For some reason, Dr. Enoch in his long life chose to keep it in his attic and
Yeah.
not to
Yeah,
publish it.
yeah, it's true. Why? I don't know.
Why? Too close.
Yeah. But if you haven't had a chance, I saw someone had, I saw the Virginia diary over there, but if you haven't had a chance to read Vivian's diaries, they're just, I am also kind of writing, one of the things about the Vivian book, The Way of Improvement Leads Home, which is over there, I think for sale, it's an academic book, but one of the things I found as I give lectures on it is that there's a story in it. The Betsy story, the love story, the striving to try to make it. It's almost like this kind of, again, if you've seen Hamilton, right? This kind of, I'm going to take my shot, kind of thing. This kind of American dream kind of story, right? The South Jersey kid goes to Princeton kind of story and, tries to make it. So whenever I teach a seminar every year to K through 12 teachers at Princeton, on colonial America, and we read the Vivian book, and it's a tragic sort of ending, right? And I can't tell you how many of these teachers tell me they are emotional at the end, like they break down into tears at the end. I'm not going to tell you what happens at the end, some of you know, but and so they convinced me that I need to write this up somehow for their these young adult, these teen history books are really hot right now. And they're like, you need to just forget all the academic jargon that's in rural enlightenment, I talk about and all this, because I had to make my bones in the profession, right? I had to convince my fellow historians that I was talking about something important and just not telling a really interesting story about a guy in Greenwich. But if I shuck all the academic stuff and just write Vivian's story, as I listen to these elementary and high school teachers, they're saying there's a story there that actually
Graphic novel.
Yeah, people might want to know this. I've been debating. And then with the Hamilton craze, everybody's crazy about early American history, so we'll see. If you haven't read the diaries, they're just phenomenal. You can just read them like a novel. Any other questions?
Thank you, John.
Thank you so much for coming out.